why should we force them to take out loans for improving or their business when what they might need are things along the line to smooth their incomes, right? So the ability to have a checking account, say. And obviously we're not necessarily talking about the same checking account that you might have at Wachovia, but the idea to smooth income. Not necessarily to go into debt on high risk type ventures like business loans. So let's take an example. Does anybody know, and I think I have an idea, I don't know for sure, when you start a business in the United States, how many of those actually are successful over the long run?
Less than 20%.
No, not a lot.
Less than 20%. And I think it's 1 in 7. So the idea is it's very high risk. Well, what's the situation is that traditionally poor people aren't looking for high risk things. They're looking for low risk, obviously. Right? So this is something we're going to be talking about. Credit cards, savings accounts, checking accounts. Things that in our context we use to manage to smooth our incomes. Because what do? We buy on a credit card, pay it off with our savings account, or pay it off through our checking account. But the money is just ways for us to use cash management. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So now when we talk about microfinance, there's some populations that are what we would call the poorest of the poor. The people that actually, as your colleague said, don't save. As a matter of fact, we might even be referring to refugees. It might be an example of this case. So what happens is that there is an income. So say, for example, these were the 12 months of someone who had income in varying amounts. But then we have this, the most vulnerable, and my boss loves this saying, it's called the deep trouble line. So which means we can call that the poverty line, right? And even more than the poverty line. The poverty line, in this case, meaning you can't feed yourself, you can't, the very basic necessities you don't need. So what happens in refugee camps? What happens? We have this where there might be some level of small income, but what goes on, what do the different camps do? They give us provisions. Excuse me. Right? So whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's shelter, any of these things are put in to bring the refugees above that line. So in this case, we're talking about a situation where it would be difficult for any microfinance to work. Why? Because if people can't generate enough money to sustain themselves, they can't generate enough to, from day to day, to get above that deep trouble line, as it is, the line where I have to feed myself, I have to feed my children. If we can't get above that, then, well, we're probably not going to be interested in taking out loans or even being able to pay them back. Well, now we have one tier up, which is the slightly less vulnerable, the people who don't always make it above this line. So say, for example, if we were to imagine a farmer in Latin America, a farmer in Africa, a farmer in Asia, might have a very similar income as this. Where when we have harvest, we have more money, correct? And we have these other, whether it's drought times or lean times, we have less. So what would you do if this is your income? What would one of you guys do? What do you think you would do? What do you already do?
We save to supplement the
exactly
harsh times.
So what would we do? We would say, well, you know what? We're going to take a little bit right here because we're going to put off today. We know that this weekend we're going to go down to Franklin Street and we're going to save a little bit of extra money. And we're going to put it right here, or actually go right here. And we're going to save a little bit of that money and we're going to put it right there because we know that sooner or later, or in this definite period of time, that we're going to need that money. So we put it away in our piggy banks, we put it away in our savings accounts, we put it away in different ways. Just like this. Right? Just as we were talking. So the idea is nothing more than the very vulnerable it's difficult for them to save. The most vulnerable. And we're talking about any level of microfinance. But there is a population that's one step above that does save and can. So we're going to talk about that population for the rest of our time. It's about the vulnerable and sort of the three products that most, in terms of the poor, what the poor are looking for, or any of us really. Savings, insurance, and credit, right? They're all about managing risk. They're all about managing and saving and planning. So the idea here is in terms of savings. What's the difference between savings and credit? What is the difference between savings and credit? Anybody have an idea?
Savings are money from yourself, credit is money you get from someone else.
Right. But guess what happens so frequently? The difference is we get the lump sum at the beginning with credit, right? And then what do? We pay it off. And then at the end we end up with no debt. Whereas with savings, we get the lump sum at the end. So in a way, they're almost, they're the same, they're a similar product, but just the mirror image of itself. So credit at the beginning and savings, we get that useful sum at the end. Also, what's the difference here? Is we're, in this situation, we're generating a debt. In this situation, we're generating activo, however you say it in English.
Asset.
Asset, yeah. So that's the idea, that we're starting, that savings and credit is very similar. The only difference is you look at it from a different side of the coin. Okay? So with that said, we've got insurance, which we'll talk about, which is sort of a middle of the road in terms of credit. Oh, in terms of the between savings and credit. So now here it is. What do people use savings for? Well, what do traditional poor people or people in general use savings for? Emergency basic needs, asset protection, predictable costs, so education. We save, and we say in 9 months we're going to have to put our daughter into school. So what do we know? That it costs X amount. So each month we have to save just a little bit so that when 9 months from now comes along, we'll be able to afford it. Insurance. Emergencies, catastrophes, asset protection as well. Credit, on the other hand, we're going to see is basically the exact same as savings. Emergency basic needs, predictable costs, debt repayment, planned investment. You know what the only difference is? And this will be important as we see the differences between savings and credit. When I was talking to a woman just recently, like I said, on my trip to Guatemala, I asked her, I said, well, do you ever save? You know, why do you take out a credit with the local money lender? Why do you take out a credit when you could just save that amount? And she's paying 20% a month. 20% a month, ladies and gentlemen. So why do you take that out when you could just save that money? And you know what she says? She says that this guy comes to her house once a week. She doesn't have to go. And she knows that every morning when she wakes up, she says she wakes up a little bit ready to work. She says, when I have money in the bank, I don't work. But when I owe the money collector, I feel like I have to get up and work. So, whatever. So anyway.